You are not allowed to pass. Step back now.
I have every right to be here. Don't touch me.
I said step back. I told you to step back. Step back. Do you understand? You can't be here.
Why?
Why?
I have my tickets. What are you doing? I just want to go. Stop. Don't touch me.
Give me the bag.
No.
I said give me the bag now.
Ow! My arm!
Oh my God! What happened? Stop resisting. You're coming with me.
You're hurting me. Get off of me.
Boots.
I said,
Put the
stop
case down and
resisting.
step back. You are not getting on this aircraft. Grant Wexler said it loud enough for the whole first-class line to hear, and he said it before Renee Calloway had finished lowering her boarding pass from the scanner. Boots. The reader was still glowing green. Seat 2C, verified. Behind her, the line for Crestline Airways Flight 147 to Portland had stacked up under the blue priority sign at Gate B22, Denver International, and every person in it was now looking at her instead of their phone. Boots. Renee did not raise her voice. She had learned decades ago that the moment you raise your voice in front of a man like this, you hand him the story he wants to tell about you. Boots. I just scanned my pass, she said. It cleared, I saw that. Then what exactly are we doing? Boots. Wexler's eyes moved from her charcoal travel suit to the scuffed black case hanging from her shoulder, and they stayed there a beat longer than they had stayed on the man ahead of her in line, a heavy-set guy in golf shorts hauling 2 oversized duffels and a garment bag half off its hanger. Boots. Nobody had stopped him. Nobody had asked him anything. We received a flag on unauthorized use of priority credentials, Wexler said. Boots. And you decided that person was me. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. You're standing in front of me. Boots. 40 minutes earlier, none of this had existed yet. Boots. Renee had been standing at a coffee cart near Concourse A, checking a spreadsheet on her phone, wearing the same unremarkable travel suit she wore to every airport in the country. No logo, no lanyard, no sign anywhere on her body announcing that the company powering the dispatch systems of 11 major U.S. carriers had her signature on its founding documents. She liked it that way. Boots. She had built Halcyon systems out of a 2-bedroom apartment in Aurora 14 years earlier after watching her father spend 31 years as a machinist at a plant that fired him 3 weeks before his pension vested, on an accusation of theft that turned out 18 months and 1 lawsuit later to be built on nothing but a supervisor's gut feeling and a missing tool that was found, eventually, exactly where Earl Calloway had said it would be. Boots. Renee had been 26 that year. She had watched her father stop trusting rooms he used to walk into without thinking twice. Boots. She had promised herself, quietly, in a way she never said out loud to anyone but her daughter, that she would spend her working life building systems that checked the record before they trusted the feeling. Boots. It was in a very real sense the entire reason Halcyon existed. She just hadn't expected to need it personally on a Tuesday morning at her own gate. Boots. A few passengers lowered their coffee cups to watch more openly now. A teenage boy near the window turned his phone sideways without quite raising it to his eye, the universal posture of someone pretending not to record. Boots. The gate agent, a young woman with a Crestline name badge reading Marissa Dostile, stepped closer to the podium, Mr. Boots. Wexler, her pass validated. I checked her photo ID myself when she checked in at 6:40. Wexler didn't look at her. Boots. We're doing an additional verification. Renee glanced past his shoulder, through the glass, at the aircraft parked on the jet bridge. Boots. A tug was already backing away from the cargo hold. 2 ramp workers were disconnecting a ground power cable. Boots. She had spent enough years of her life inside airports to know the particular rhythm of a gate tightening toward departure, and she knew, the way you know weather is changing before the sky tells you, that something here was about to go very wrong. Boots. My identification is in your hand, she said. What are you verifying? Wexler held out his palm, the case. Her fingers closed around the handle. Boots. Inside that case was the reason she had refused to check a bag at Reagan National that morning, a hardened company laptop. Boots. A hardware authentication key, silver, no larger than a car remote, engraved on the underside with 2 letters she had never once let out of arm's reach in 14 years. Boots. And a sealed diagnostic module that had spent the last 60 hours connected directly to Crestline's Dispatch Integrity Lab under a signed custody agreement that had cleared airport security at 6:12 that morning, on paper, with a signature. Boots. None of it was classified. None of it was dangerous. All of it had a documented chain of custody that required exactly one thing from the person holding it. Don't let it out of your hands until the chain says you can. Boots. No, she said. Wexler gave a thin smile that seemed built for the audience behind her rather than for her. Boots. Then you're refusing a direct security instruction. I'm refusing to hand controlled equipment to someone who hasn't given me a reason to. Boots. Somewhere behind her, a man in the first class line exhaled loudly, the kind of exhale meant to be heard. Boots. Can we just board already? Wexler looked pleased to finally have an audience on his side. Exactly. Everybody here is trying to get somewhere. Boots. Renee heard the shape of what he was building. She was no longer a passenger with a delay. She was the obstruction. Boots. Doyle frowned at her screen. Mr. Wexler, the reservation notes say this equipment was pre-cleared by operations before 6:30. Gate agents don't determine security clearance, Wexler snapped. Boots. No, Doyle said quieter now, but the notation came from operations. That should have ended this before it started. Renee waited to see if he would take that exit. Boots. He didn't. He reached for the case instead, and she moved it behind her hip without thinking, the way you'd move a child out of traffic. Boots. Do not touch that. Wexler's radio came off his belt. Need a second officer at B-22, passengers becoming non-compliant. The word traveled farther than his voice did. Boots. Non-compliant. Renee felt something old rise behind her ribs, a heat with a very specific memory attached to it. 19 years earlier, in an emergency room in Cleveland, she had watched a nurse write the word agitated on her father's intake chart because pain had made his voice louder than the nurse was comfortable with. Boots. Earl Calloway had waited 2 hours and 11 minutes past every white patient who arrived after him. Renee had been 28 years old, sitting in a plastic chair, memorizing the wallpaper pattern so she wouldn't have to watch her father's face. Boots. She had promised herself that night that she would never again let someone else's adjective decide the facts about her. Boots. That promise had cost her before. It was about to cost her again. A second officer arrived at a jog. Boots. Wexler pointed at the case. Take it. Doyle stepped forward. Wait, I think we should call operations first. Boots. Wexler ignored her. The second officer's hand closed around Renee's wrist first, not the case. A short, hard grip meant to make a point rather than move her anywhere. Boots. Somewhere behind her, a woman gasped audibly. The teenage boy by the window finally raised his phone all the way up. Boots. Renee did not pull away, and she did not go rigid. She simply looked down at the hand on her wrist, then up at the officer's face, and held it there until he understood, without her saying a word, exactly how that moment was going to look, played back later. Boots. He let go. His hand moved to the case instead, and this time Renee released it, because his other hand was already resting on his belt, and she had done enough triage in her life to know the exact moment a fight over an object turns into a fight over a body, and she had no intention of letting this become that. Boots. The officer took the case. Something inside gave off a soft electronic chirp, and both officers went still. Not fear, Renee thought, watching them. Boots. Calculation. She glanced at her watch, then at the case now tilted sideways against the officer's vest. Put it flat, she said. Boots now. Wexler laughed once, a short, ugly sound. You don't give instructions here. Renee looked past him at Doyle. Call Halcyon Network Operations. Boots. Tell them a custody token has been separated from its registered holder at gate B-22. Doyle stared at her for a second too long. Boots. Then the gate terminal beside her chimed twice, sharp and electronic. On the overhead departure board, Flight 11147 flipped from boarding to hold. Boots. 3 seconds later, the flight on the adjacent screen did the same, then another. Wexler's smile disappeared. Renee watched red hold markers begin appearing down the board in clusters, like a fever spreading across a chart. Boots. Put the case down, she said again, now. The second officer set it on the carpet, both hands raised and visible without being asked twice. Boots. Doyle already had the gate phone against her ear. Network operations, gate B-22. I need a custody status check tied to a Halcyon systems token. Yes. Flight 1 pass. No, the passenger has not boarded. Boots. Wexler stepped toward the counter. Tell them this is a local security matter. Doyle covered the receiver with her palm. Boots. They're asking who removed the token from the registered holder. I did, Wexler said. She refused inspection. Renee turned to face him fully for the first time since this had started. Boots. You didn't ask for an inspection. You ordered me to surrender a controlled case after my identity, and my boarding authorization had already cleared. Boots. That's not the same thing, and you know it. That's your interpretation. The terminal chimed again. On the board, hold became under review across a widening cluster of gates. Boots. A child near the window asked her mother, in the too loud voice of a 7-year-old, why all the red boxes kept showing up. Boots. Nobody answered her. The man in golf shorts who had complained about boarding earlier had gone quiet. He was no longer looking at his phone. Boots. He was looking at the spot on Renee's wrist where the officer's fingers had been, and something in his posture had folded inward, the particular stillness of a person realizing, a beat too late to matter, that he'd been rooting for the wrong side of something without ever bothering to ask what side he was on. Boots. Doyle's face went tight as someone spoke into her ear. What do you mean, system-wide? Renee already knew what the alert meant and what it didn't. Boots. Halcyon's dispatch integrity software didn't cancel flights. It froze automated release on any departure, still waiting on a verification handshake. The second it detected a registered credential that had left its holder's control during an active validation window. Boots. It was a safeguard. It was working exactly as it had been built to work. It also had absolutely no way of knowing, from where it sat, that the person it had just locked, 312 flights around, was standing 11 feet from the case in question, calmly refusing to yell. Boots. But that part of the story hadn't caught up with anyone at Gate B-22 yet, and it was about to get much worse before it got better. Boots. Doyle set the receiver against her shoulder. Automated dispatch release has paused on 312 departures nationwide until they confirm whether the token was compromised. Boots. Wexler stared at Renee like she'd pulled a fire alarm with her bare hands. You did this, no. I told them to report what happened. Boots. Same difference, it isn't. A man in a Crestline operations vest came jogging up the concourse, badge reading Foster Lane, duty operations manager. Boots. He went straight to Doyle first. Talk to me. The token was removed from the holder, Doyle said, nodding at the case. Boots. Physically separated. Then it chirped. Lane crouched beside the case without touching it. Who's handled it since separation? He did, Renee said, nodding at the second officer. Boots. Then he put it down. Anybody open it? No, the officer said quickly. Wexler cut in before Lane could ask anything else. Boots. The passenger refused a lawful security request and then triggered an external system shutdown. Lane looked up. External? She works for Halcyon, Doyle said. Boots. Lane went very still. As in the integrity platform running under our dispatch system? Renee met his eyes. Yes. Boots. Wexler looked at her boarding pass again, like it might have changed. What's your role there? Renee hesitated for exactly one breath. Boots. She had spent enough of her adult life watching rooms change temperature the instant they heard a title, and she did not enjoy what that temperature change said about the room. Boots. Registered custodian for the validation session, she said. That's the fact that matters right now. Wexler gave a short, humorless laugh. Boots. Convenient. Lane ignored him entirely. Can the hold be cleared? If the chain of custody is intact and the token hasn't been accessed, yes. Boots. Then let's verify it. Not here, Wexler said, folding his arms. Custody protocol requires 2 witnesses, a logged environment, and a Halcyon technical representative to attest the seal condition. Boots. Lane's expression shifted. He knew procedure well enough to recognize it wasn't wrong. Wexler heard the pause as weakness. Boots. You're prolonging this, he said to Renee. I'm preventing you from turning your mistake into one nobody can undo. Lane raised his radio. Boots. Operations control, this is Lane at B-22. I need every camera feed and access log from this gate preserved, starting now. Boots. I'm placing local handling under review until chain verification is complete. You don't have authority over security, Wexler said. No, Lane said. Boots. I have authority over Crestline's operational record, and I'm preserving it. That was the moment the story should have ended. The correct people had arrived. The correct instinct had kicked in. Cooler heads were reaching for procedure. Boots. Renee let herself believe, for about 4 seconds, that this was already over. It wasn't. Wexler still had a keyboard in front of him, and he was about to use it in a way none of them could take back. Boots. Doyle looked at her screen and went pale. Foster, security already filed an incident note. Lane turned. Says what? Boots. Doyle swallowed. Passenger Calloway attempted to bypass screening protocol using unverified technical equipment, became verbally non-compliant when challenged. Renee looked at Wexler. Boots. He didn't deny writing it. Neither sentence described anything that had actually happened at that gate, and both were now sitting in her permanent passenger record, time-stamped, where any future gate agent anywhere in the country could read them without ever having stood at gate B22 to see for themselves. Boots. Who entered that? Lane asked, though he already knew. Doyle tilted the monitor. Security Supervisor Wexler, 6:51 a.m. Boots. Wexler squared his shoulders. That's an accurate summary of the interaction. No, Renee said, and for the first time her voice dropped, not louder, quieter, the register she used in board meetings right before she said something that ended a discussion. Boots. It's an accusation dressed up as a summary. He looked almost relieved that she'd finally pushed back directly. You were told to cooperate. Boots. You refused. Now 300 flights are frozen because of equipment you brought into my gate. My equipment was cleared before I arrived. Boots. According to you. According to the timestamp, Doyle said, pointing at her screen. It's right here. 6:12 a.m. Boots. She isn't security, Wexler said, waving her off, and Renee felt the old temptation, the one she'd spent 20 years training herself out of, to reach for her phone and call Halcyon's general counsel by name, to demand Crestline's executive office get someone down to this gate in the next 10 minutes, to let her Fury do what Fury does best, which is feel enormous and accomplish nothing. Boots. Instead, she looked at Doyle. Can you export the original operations notation with its creations timestamp? I think so, please do. Boots. Wexler stepped in front of the terminal. She doesn't get internal records. Lane moved between him and the counter. I requested preservation. Boots. She didn't request release. Those aren't the same thing. Wexler either didn't understand the distinction or didn't care to. His radio crackled. Boots. He answered with a clipped acknowledgement, and when he turned back to Renee, something in his posture had hardened. Miss. Boots. Calloway. Crestline Security is denying you boarding on Flight 11147 pending review. Doyle's head snapped up. What? You heard me. Boots. Lane lowered his radio slowly. On what basis? Failure to comply with a screening instruction and an unresolved equipment issue. Boots. Renee looked through the glass. The aircraft door was still open. A ramp worker stood by the tug below, waiting for instructions that weren't coming. Boots. Somewhere inside that airport, more than 300 flight crews were watching their own clocks slide sideways, because a man had decided her equipment case looked wrong on her shoulder. Boots. Her meeting in Portland started that afternoon. Not a board meeting, not a keynote. Her daughter Zora was presenting the final capstone project for the architecture fellowship she'd spent 11 months trying to win, in front of a panel that included 2 people who could offer her a job on the spot. Boots. Renee had missed enough of Zora's presentations over the years that her daughter had stopped asking, months in advance, whether she'd actually make it this time. Boots. This time Renee had promised. Not I'll try, a promise. She took her phone out. Wexler's hand shot up. No recording. Boots. I'm not recording you. She opened the message thread from Zora instead. Front row saved for you. No excuses this time, with a laughing emoji that suddenly looked less funny than it had at 5 that morning. Boots. For the first time since the confrontation began, Renee looked tired. Doyle noticed. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Don't apologize for his decision, Renee said, and locked her screen. Boots. Wexler lifted his chin like the matter was finally settled. Lane said, if you remove her from the flight, the custody verification still has to happen. Boots. Then it happens without her. No, Renee said. You don't control that, Wexler said. She does, Lane said, if she's the registered custodian. Boots. A voice came from the first-class line, so she never tried to bypass anything. The teenage boy by the window had stepped forward, suddenly looking less certain now that a dozen adults were looking back at him. Boots. His mother touched his sleeve. Miles. I saw it, he said. She scanned like everybody else. It went green. Boots. He held up his phone. I've been recording the departure board because the hold alerts looked weird. I caught the start of this, too. Boots. His mother closed her eyes. Don't post it, Renee said. Miles blinked. What? Save the original. Don't edit it. Don't send it around yet. Boots. Wexler said that recording may violate airport policy. Then policy can be reviewed later, Lane said. The original still needs to be preserved. Boots. Renee pulled a business card from her wallet, wrote a case reference number on the back in pen, and held it out. Boots. Give this to your mother. If Crestline's investigators reach out, provide the original through the formal request. Keep your own copy. Boots. Wexler shook his head. You're turning a passenger issue into an investigation. Renee looked at the incident note, still glowing on Doyle's screen beneath her own name. Boots. No, she said. You did that. The moment you wrote a report you knew hadn't been verified. She opened Halcyon's secure portal on her phone and submitted a single request. Preserve token telemetry, authorization history, and all Crestline validation activity beginning at 6:30 that morning. Boots. A confirmation number appeared. Across the concourse, the departure board refreshed. 312. Under review. None released. Renee put the phone back in her pocket. Boots. For the first time all morning, Wexler stopped looking like a man who thought he'd already won. Lane moved the verification to the operations room behind gate B24, where entry required a badge tap and every workstation action logged automatically. Boots. Wexler objected before they'd even reached the door. This passenger has been denied boarding. She should be escorted out of the secure area, not brought further in. Boots. Her equipment is now part of an active operations review, Lane said, not slowing down. She's still a security issue. Boots. Renee heard the shift, and it landed harder than anything he'd said at the gate. She was no longer a woman who had refused to hand over a case. Boots. She had become a category, one flexible enough to justify whatever happened to her next. Lane stopped walking and looked at him. Boots. Then document the specific threat in writing, right now. Wexler said nothing. Inside, the operations room smelled like burnt coffee and warm electronics. Boots. A Halcyon field engineer named Denise Okafor was already pulling up the custody interface on a wide monitor, her badge lanyard swinging as she typed. Boots. Doyle stood near the printer holding the reservation record she'd preserved. Renee stayed beside the black case, close enough to touch it, not touching it. Boots. Her phone buzzed Zora. She let it ring once before answering. Hey, you're still in Denver. Renee closed her eyes. Boots. The flight tracking app had already told her daughter everything Renee had hoped to explain gently, on her own terms, later. Boots. There's an operational problem. You always have an operational problem. Zora. No, I know that sounds unfair. Boots. The hurt in her daughter's voice was worse for being so carefully controlled. Renee turned toward the narrow window overlooking the ramp. Boots. I can try to get pulled off this and put on another carrier. No, Okafor said immediately, without looking up from her screen. Boots. Renee covered the phone. Okafor pointed at the custody display. The token registered a separation event. Until we validate the seal and complete the holder challenge, you're part of the recovery procedure whether you leave this airport or not. Boots. Renee already knew that. She'd known it before the offer left her mouth. It had been a bad idea born out of guilt, the kind you reach for when you'd rather feel like you're doing something than sit still inside a mistake that isn't yours. Boots. Zora had heard enough through the phone to guess the shape of it. Don't wreck something trying to prove you're coming, she said. Boots. That's not the same as actually coming. Renee stared at a departing aircraft crossing the far taxiway. I promised. I wanted to be there. Boots. That's different. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Call me when you know what's real, Zora finally said, and the line went quiet. Boots. Renee held the phone against her ear one more second before lowering it. Lane was pretending to study a monitor he wasn't reading. Boots. Doyle wasn't pretending, your daughter? Yes. Renee nodded once. I'm sorry. This time she accepted the apology instead of deflecting it. Boots. Okafor pulled up the seal inspection log. External shell intact, no opening event recorded. She paused, enlarging a timestamp. But I've got something else. Boots. The custody alarm had triggered at 6:47:16 that morning. Doyle checked the printed incident note. Wexler entered his report at 6:51. Boots. Right, Okafor said. But he wrote that the equipment issue was identified after Ms. Calloway refused a secondary inspection. She opened a second record. Boots. The pre-clearance was acknowledged by airport security at 6:12. Lane frowned. Acknowledged by whom? Okafor rotated the screen. Grant Wexler. Boots. Nobody spoke. Wexler had followed them into the room a step behind and now saw his own name lit up across the display. Boots. That acknowledgement doesn't mean I personally reviewed the passenger, he said. No, Renee said. It means your unit received the clearance before you told everyone the equipment was unverified. Boots. It was still subject to standard inspection, but you already knew it wasn't a mystery. Then why didn't you just say that at the gate? Boots. Because you made the interaction adversarial from the first sentence. Lane looked at him for a long moment. She asked what you were verifying. Boots. You wouldn't answer. She challenged every instruction after that. Because you never gave her a reason to trust the first one. Boots. Doyle unfolded the reservation printout. There's something else I need to show you. At the bottom of the operations notation was a routing code none of them had noticed at the gate. Mission Custody. Alerts. Do not separate. Boots. Lane read it twice. His radio crackled. Ops control to Lane. We've completed the first network audit. Automated holds are functioning as designed. Boots. No compromise detected yet. Can departures release? Not until Halcyon completes holder authentication. Wexler exhaled. Good. Then this is over. Boots. Okafor lifted a hand before anyone answered him. There's another problem. She brought up the security access history. Someone had opened Renee's pre-clearance record at 6:43 that morning, 4 minutes before she'd even reached the gate. Boots. The user ID belonged to Wexler. He stared at the timestamp for several seconds before he found anything to say. Boots. I opened the record because the priority credential looked unusual. Doyle stared at him. You hadn't seen her boarding pass yet. Boots. I was reviewing passengers flagged for additional attention. Lane pointed at the audit trail. There's no flag entered before your access. Boots. You opened her file first. The flag came after. Wexler's jaw tightened. We get fraudulent premium credentials constantly. Did anything in her record suggest fraud? Boots. Lane asked. The credential was. Okafor shook her head before he finished. It's a standard enterprise travel credential. We process 100 of them a day through this gate alone. Boots. The name didn't mean anything to me, Wexler said. Renee almost smiled, and there was nothing funny anywhere near it. Boots. My name wasn't required to mean anything to you. That was never the requirement. Okafor turned back to the custody interface. Boots. We still have 312 departures waiting. Miss Calloway, I need to complete holder authentication. Do it. Okafor inserted a Crestline authorization key. Boots. Renee placed the hardware token into its cradle and entered her personal challenge response. A profile bloomed across the screen. Boots. Halcyon Systems, Custoden. Renee Calloway, Executive Authority, Chief Executive Officer, Signortry. Doyle inhaled audibly. Boots. Lane looked from the screen to Renee and back. Wexler didn't move. Renee wished, briefly and completely uselessly, that the title hadn't needed to appear at all. Boots. She had watched this exact transformation happen in 100 rooms over 20 years. Suspicion turning to politeness, interruption turning into the same person, suddenly granted complexity, all because a job title had finally supplied it for them. Boots. Lane recovered first. You're the CEO of Halcyon. Yes. Doyle glanced at Wexler. She shouldn't have needed to be. No, Renee said. Boots. She shouldn't. That sentence ended the moment more cleanly than any amount of anger could have. Okafor completed the first authentication stage. Boots. Token signature matches. No unauthorized challenge attempts. Lane lifted his radio. Control, this is B-24. Verification confirms physical integrity and holder identity. Boots. The answer came back through static. Copy. Preparing staged release. Wexler exhaled again, longer this time. Good. Then this is finally over. Boots. Renee turned to face him fully. No. He looked genuinely confused, as if the word hadn't occurred to him as an option. Boots. The hold is clearing. The flight hold is ending. The incident isn't. She pointed at the audit trail on the monitor. Boots. Your report says you discovered an equipment problem after I refused inspection. Your own access log shows you read the clearance and the custody restriction 4 minutes before I ever reached the gate. Boots. You didn't discover anything. You went looking for a reason, and then you used my reaction to your suspicion as proof that your suspicion had been correct all along. Boots. Wexler opened his mouth. Lane cut him off before a single word left it. Don't add anything else until security management has reviewed the full record. Boots. It was the first real restriction anyone had placed on him all morning, and something in Wexler's face changed when he heard it. Not shame yet, not even close, but the first flicker of a man realizing the room had stopped being on his side. Boots. Okafor's screen refreshed. 2 flights changed from hold to release pending, then a cluster of 6 more. The network was coming back online in careful, controlled batches, each one a small mechanical exhale after a held breath. Boots. Doyle watched the numbers fall. 281 still held, then 240, validating by departure window, a process that would take most of the next hour whether anyone in that room wanted it to or not. Boots. Lane received a message on his tablet and frowned. What? He turned the screen toward the group. Someone had run a search for other uses of the exact pretext code Wexler had entered on Renee's file, PCR-7 Priority Credential Review, across the previous 90 days. Boots. It had not been used once, it had been used 11 times. Different gates, different flights. Every single flagged traveler was black. Boots. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. The operations room's cooling fan clicked behind the monitors, louder now that the silence had nothing to hide behind. Boots. That doesn't mean anything, Wexler finally said. Pattern isn't proof. No, Lane said quietly. But it's not nothing either, and it's not going to stay in this room. Boots. Wexler looked at the 11 names scrolling down the screen the way a man looks at a scale that has just told him something he already knew and had been telling himself not to know. Boots. He didn't apologize. He straightened his shirt collar instead, a small, private, useless gesture, and said the only thing his pride still had room for. Boots. I followed procedure. Renee looked at him for a long moment, not with hatred, which would have been easier, but with something closer to exhausted recognition, the specific tiredness of watching a familiar shape repeat itself in a new room. Boots. No, she said. You followed a feeling, and then you built the procedure underneath it afterward, so it would look like the feeling had never been there at all. Boots. That's the part that should scare you. Not that you got caught, that you don't actually see the difference. She checked her watch. Boots. Seattle. No, Portland was slipping further away, with every held flight on that board, and there was nothing left in that room she could do to speed it up. Boots. Denise Okafor kept working the batches. Lane kept the radio against his ear, relaying updates in a flat, careful voice, while 300 crews across the country waited on a decision none of them had made and couldn't undo. Boots. By 8:40, the last cluster cleared. Release complete flashed across the board where hold had spread an hour earlier, and somewhere on the tarmac, a Crestline 737 that had nothing to do with Gate B-22 finally pushed back on schedule 41 minutes late, carrying passengers who would never know why. Boots. Flight 1147 itself had already left without her. Renee watched it climb out over the front range from the operations room window, small and silver, and completely indifferent to what had just happened underneath it. Boots. Lane found her a seat on the 1105 instead, the earliest option left after 90 minutes of automated holds, and by the time she called Zora back, she had already done the math on exactly how much of the presentation she was going to miss. Boots. I'm not going to make the opening, she said. I might make the last 20 minutes. There was a long pause on the line. Boots. 20 minutes is more than I expected an hour ago, Zora finally said, and something in her voice had softened, just slightly, around the edges of her disappointment. Boots. Just get here. I don't need the whole thing. I need you in the room when they say my name. Boots. I'll be in the room. She was. Boots. She slid into a folding chair at the back of a university auditorium in Portland at 3:52 that afternoon, 22 minutes before her daughter's name was called. Her travel suit creased from 6 hours of connections and holds, the black case still on her shoulder, because some habits don't turn off just because the crisis technically ended. Boots. Zora spotted her from the stage mid-setup, and for just a second, stopped moving. Then she smiled, not the careful, guarded smile she'd been giving her mother for the last 2 years of missed events, but something looser, something that looked, for the first time in a while, like relief instead of resignation. Boots. That was the frozen moment nobody in that auditorium understood the weight of except the two of them. A mother sliding into a folding chair, a daughter's shoulders dropping half an inch, no words exchanged, everything already said. Boots. 4 months later, Renee read the final compliance report at her kitchen table in Denver on a Sunday morning, while Zora argued with a stubborn cabinet hinge across the room. Boots. The report did not call what happened at Gate B-22 a misunderstanding. Boots. It found that Grant Wexler had used discretionary credential reviews inconsistently over a period of at least 4 months, documented his own assumptions as established facts in official incident records, and disregarded an existing custody instruction he had personally accessed 9 minutes before confronting a passenger about it. Boots. 34 passenger records connected to the PCR-7 pattern had been corrected. Boots. 21 travelers received reimbursement for documented expenses tied to unsupported interventions. Missed connections, rebooked flights, one hotel night in Newark that a 61-year-old retired schoolteacher named Doris Fenimore had paid for out of pocket because nobody at the gate that day had bothered to explain why her flight had suddenly, silently, stopped moving. Boots. Compliance could not establish measurable financial harm in the remaining cases, but every affected passenger received a written notice explaining exactly what had happened and how their record had been corrected. Boots. Wexler had been terminated for misuse of discretionary review authority, inaccurate incident reporting, and failure to follow an existing technical custody procedure he had documented reading and then ignored. Boots. His security certification, tied to a federal transportation credential, had been suspended pending a separate review that would very likely end it permanently. Boots. 2 other officers received mandatory retraining for relying on unverified local shorthand notes instead of the actual record in front of them. Boots. 1 supervisor received a formal written warning for approving incident reports without reviewing the underlying data attached to them. Marissa Doyle received protected witness status during the investigation and no disciplinary action of any kind. Boots. Her performance review would note, in writing, that she had challenged an unsafe instruction from a supervisor in real time, under pressure, in front of a full gate of passengers. Boots. That mattered more to her, Renee later learned, than almost anything else in the entire process. The pretext code PCR-7 had been permanently removed from every Crestline security terminal in the network. Boots. Any future credential intervention now required a selectable, policy-linked reason before it could even be logged, and compliance would sample the decisions monthly for demographic disparities going forward. Boots. The numbers went straight to Crestline's board risk committee every quarter, not just to security management, where they could quietly disappear into a drawer the way they always had before. Boots. In the 12 weeks, compliance had spent sampling every credential intervention at Denver International. After the incident, the rate of unsupported reviews had fallen from 31% in the historical baseline sample to 4%. Boots. 2 of the 11 previously flagged travelers agreed to be contacted directly. One was a hospice nurse from Aurora who had been pulled aside twice in the same month for a badge that matched every requirement on the airline's own list. Boots. The other was a college freshman flying home for his grandmother's funeral, delayed 40 extra minutes at a gate while an officer who was not Wexler, but had been trained under him, ran a check that turned up nothing because there had never been anything to find. Boots. Neither of them had filed a complaint at the time. Both later told Grace Holloway's team the same thing, in almost the same words. They hadn't believed anyone would read it if they had. Boots. Not perfect. Renee closed the file. Zora looked over from the cabinet, screwdriver in hand. That face. What face? Boots. The one you get when a spreadsheet has personally offended you. It's a PDF. Worse, Zora crossed the kitchen and took the screwdriver back from her mother's open hand, because Renee had somehow already reached for the hinge without noticing. Boots. You stripped the screw. I inherited your confidence. You did not inherit my technique. That remains under review, Renee said, and Zora actually laughed, a full, unguarded sound that filled the kitchen in a way it hadn't in longer than either of them wanted to admit. Boots. The fellowship had given Zora a studio placement in Seattle for the coming year. Renee still disliked how much of her daughter's life she now experienced through a phone screen instead of a folding chair in the room. But they had stopped pretending that one missed presentation could ever be repaired by one dramatic promise made after the fact. Boots. Renee had started making smaller promises instead. Dinner on Sundays when both of them were actually in town. A call every Wednesday night, no exceptions. Boots. And never, under any circumstances, I'll try, when what she meant was probably not. Her phone buzzed on the table. Boots. A message from Grace Holloway, Crestline's head of compliance. Boots. The final line of the report had just been approved for public release. Crestline would acknowledge that the flight holds on the morning in question had been caused by a properly functioning custody safeguard, triggered after controlled equipment was separated from its registered holder without cause, and that the passenger involved had been fully authorized to travel and had not caused the operational interruption through any misconduct of her own. Boots. Renee read the wording twice. Months earlier, in the raw heat of that gate, she had imagined wanting Wexler's name attached publicly to every single correction, wanting the world to see exactly whose decisions had frozen 312 flights over nothing. Boots. She found, reading it now at her own kitchen table, with her daughter fighting a cabinet hinge 6 feet away, that she no longer wanted that. Boots. The record needed accuracy more than it needed spectacle. She typed back, approved from Halcyon's side. Keep the passenger correction language exactly as written. Boots. Then she opened a second document, Halcyon's own internal review of that same morning, because justice, she had decided a long time ago, did not require pretending her own system was beyond improvement just because someone else's mistake had triggered it. Boots. The custody safeguard had worked exactly as designed, but its network response had been broader than strictly necessary. 312 departures had entered manual review because the platform couldn't yet distinguish a compromised token from a simple physical separation event fast enough. Boots. Her engineers had already narrowed the response. Future incidents would isolate only the systems actually dependent on the affected validation session, unless additional compromise indicators appeared. Boots. Renee had insisted that fix be prioritized above 3 other feature requests that quarter. Being right about someone else's failure had never once meant her own system got a pass. Boots. By late afternoon, the cabinet door hung straight again. Zora tested it twice, satisfied, then glanced back at her mother. Boots. There, see? All it needed was somebody holding the flashlight steady. Executive leadership, Renee said. Zora rolled her eyes, but she was smiling when she did it. Boots. Somewhere in a strip mall on the far east side of Denver, 3 weeks after his termination, Grant Wexler sat in his car in the parking lot of a security staffing office that had just told him, politely but without much room for negotiation, that his suspended federal credential made him a difficult placement for the next 18 months. Boots. He had gone in that morning expecting a formality. He had come out instead with a folder of paperwork and a very quiet drive back to his car. Boots. He didn't turn the engine on right away. He sat there with his hands on the wheel, replaying, not for the first time, but for the first time without an audience to perform certainty for, the exact sequence the audit trail had laid out in that operations room. Boots. 6:43. He'd opened her file first. 6:44. He'd read the custody instruction. 6:45. He'd typed the note. He had told himself, every single day since, that he'd simply followed procedure, that the credential had looked unusual, that anyone in his position would have done the same thing. Boots. But there had been no flag before his access. He had built the flag. He had gone looking, and then he had found exactly what he'd gone looking for, and he had told himself the finding had come first. Boots. He thought about the retired schoolteacher from the report, Doris Fenimore, a name he'd never learned until compliance read it to him in his exit interview, a woman who'd paid for her own hotel room in Newark because a system he was supposed to be running had frozen without explanation, and nobody at that gate had known enough to tell her why. Boots. He thought about 10 other names he'd never bothered to learn either, back when learning them hadn't seemed necessary. He did not call anyone that afternoon to apologize. Boots. He didn't know, honestly, if he ever would. Some habits of self-protection run deeper than a single afternoon in a parking lot can dig out. Boots. But he did open his phone, scroll to a note app he hadn't used in months, and type 4 sentences he never sent to anyone. Boots. I told myself the feeling came after the facts. It didn't. I don't know yet what to do with knowing that. Boots. I'm not going to pretend I don't know it anymore. He deleted it 20 minutes later. But he remembered writing it. Boots. And the next time he stood behind a counter, a different job, months after, checking IDs at a concert venue on the west side of the city, and felt that old, familiar flicker of suspicion rise up at the sight of a black man in an expensive coat holding a garment bag, he stopped himself before he acted on it and made himself ask one question first. What actually happened here, before I decided what I already believed? Boots. It wasn't redemption. Nobody handed him one. But it was the first time in longer than he could remember that the feeling hadn't simply been allowed to run the whole show by itself. Boots. Back at gate B22 on an ordinary Tuesday morning 8 months later, the scanner flashed green for the next passenger in the priority line. Boots. This time the agent on duty, not Marissa Doyle, who had since transferred into Crestline's operations track on Foster Lane's personal recommendation, but a newer hire following the same updated protocol, looked at the actual record on her screen before she decided anything at all about the person standing in front of her. Boots. That was the part of the story that never made it into any headline. Not the frozen flights. Not the CEO's name lighting up a terminal screen like a verdict. Boots. Just a gate agent, on a morning nobody would remember, choosing to read the record first. Renee kept the brass tag from her father's old tool case, clipped to the same black equipment case she still carried through every airport in the country. E. Boots. C. Worn nearly smooth now from 20 years of thumbs running over the letters without meaning to. Earl Calloway had never gotten an apology from that emergency room in Cleveland, and he had died 4 years later still carrying the particular specific tiredness of a man who'd had to prove, over and over, that his own pain was real. Boots. Renee couldn't give her father that apology retroactively, but she could make sure that every system her company built made it a little harder for his version and Svetterfee to happen, quietly, unremarked, to somebody who didn't have a boarding pass with the word CEO, waiting 3 layers beneath it to save them. Boots. She didn't need the title to deserve to be believed the first time. Nobody should. That was the whole point, and she had learned a long time ago that saying it out loud usually mattered less than simply building the world in a way that didn't require saying it at all.